You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 15th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
India and Canada send each other's ambassadors packing. North Korea is at it again, and the Central European party destination turning the beer taps off. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests John Everard and Terry Stiastny will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Saad Mohseni about his new memoir recalling the building of Afghanistan's first free media empire. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I'm joined today by John Everard, former British diplomat, ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea, and Terry Stiastny, political journalist and author. Hello to you both.
Hello.
You have both been traversing these islands in recent days. John, first of all, you have travelled by bicycle to Macclesfield, which sort of sounds like some sort of Victorian memoir of exploration or possibly an ill-advised dare.
If only it was so romantic. In fact, I went to Macclesfield because, cough, sigh, sob, it's finally happened. The first of my friends has had his 70th birthday. The Grim Reaper beckons just over the horizon. So I went to this party full of nice 1950s cakes and nice 1950s tea and lots of nice 1950s people as well. And we all sat around and discussed medical conditions for a couple of hours and then got tired and went home.
What was your general impression of Macclesfield, a conurbation I don't believe we've ever mentioned on the Monocle Daily? Hello to our many listeners in Macclesfield, about which the only thing I know is that it is the hometown of somewhat unreconstructed punk rock legends, the Mac Lads, best known for their anthem, Beer and Sex and Chips and Gravy.
Oh, that anthem, I confess, had actually passed me by.
It wasn't played at the party?
No, it wasn't played at the party. Tragically, I should have put in a special request. But lots of other good, unreconstructed things in Macclesfield. I mean, I don't drink alcohol, but friends there tell me they've got some wonderful 1950s pubs, unchanged,
including the clientele.
Probably including the clientele, that's right. None of your gastropub nonsense, proper beer. Also, a proper 1950s bike shop where somebody actually knew how to repair a bicycle, a rare luxury these days. So Macclesfield, I reckon, has got quite a lot to recommend it.
OK, well, I've mentioned the Mac Lads now on Monocle Radio. I feel like my life's work is accomplished. Terry, you were further north.
I was further north. I didn't go by bicycle, but I've been to Edinburgh for a lovely couple of days doing some research in the National Library of Scotland, which I can recommend. The sort of manuscripts room has one of the most beautiful views of central Edinburgh. You can kind of see the cathedral on one side and Arthur's Seat on the other. And I was looking at some papers that I don't think anyone's seen in a good long time. So it was really interesting.
Well, we will start properly with Canada and India, now thoroughly at loggerheads, whatever loggerheads even are. Canada has thrown out India's High Commissioner, Sanjay Kumar Verma, and 5 other Indian diplomats. In response, India has thrown out Canada's High Commissioner, Stuart Ross Wheeler, and 5 other Canadian diplomats. It is a significant escalation in an extraordinary row which has been rumbling on between the two Commonwealth countries for some while. At the heart of it is the murder in British Columbia last June of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a prominent Sikh separatist. John, first of all, we will come to the case itself, but it is very handy to have you here as our guide to degrees of diplomatic spat. We are clearly way beyond a mere summoning here, or even a summoning without biscuits. How big a deal is the actual slinging out of the ambassador/High Commissioner?
It's a pretty big deal. I mean, slinging out or declaring persona non grata lesser diplomats is a signal, a slap across the face, a warning. Throwing out the High Commissioner himself is really quite a heavy thing to do. I mean, you are only a few steps away from actually sort of seeking the closure of the mission, which in current circumstances would be a terrible pity because it seems that India and Canada have got a whole lot to talk about right now.
Well, indeed. And just before we talk about that, were you ever actually thrown out of anywhere or threatened with it?
Despite heroic efforts, no, I never quite managed that.
You didn't manage to upset the Belarusians or the North Koreans sufficiently?
Oh, I've upset them in all kinds of ways, but not enough to actually get thrown out. I nearly managed this in Uruguay. I was accused of behaving disrespectfully to a Uruguayan senator who protested, but the Uruguayan foreign minister told him to go away and not be so silly, so I stayed.
Terry, we should address the case at hand, which is... it is just bizarre. It's one of those things that the more you read about it, the less sense it makes. Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, is now openly accusing India of sending agents to Canada to commit, as he put it, homicides, extortions and violent acts against Canada's Sikh population, which is, after India, the second biggest in the world. It just sounds kind of fantastic, doesn't it?
It does sound fantastic, but he is backed up by the Canadian police, who seem to say that there is this broad campaign. They have alleged that organised crime is even involved in this. They say homicides, extortion, and there are similar allegations going on within the United States. Where they claim that there's a plot which they believe is organised by India against another Sikh separatist leader. So these are such serious allegations that you can't imagine that both the government and the police would be making them unless they had something to back them up with.
John, India, it's important to be clear, denies absolutely everything, as India would. But if it is true, and as Terry was saying, the Canadians certainly sound pretty convinced about the evidence they have, in what imaginable universe would India have thought to themselves, we'll totally get away with this, it'll never come out?
I don't think that's what they're thinking. I think it's more Canada doesn't really matter that much. This is only Canada. And if we stand tough and make clear that whatever other countries, even fellow Commonwealth countries, think we are going to root out what we regard as terrorists in any part of the world, others will stand down. I think it's a gross miscalculation. I think they've simply alienated a whole lot of people at a time when India can ill afford to do so. But that's probably what they're thinking.
I mean, it's hard to imagine, Terry, from this point how a relationship gets rebuilt. But yeah, as I said in the introduction, these are two members of the Commonwealth, in theory, allies in good standing.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's pretty unusual for, people that you normally think of as sort of attending the same summits, going to the same, generally being on similar sides in international issues, to have such a fierce debate or such a fierce, sort of exchange of allegations. And, I don't know if, the Commonwealth or, for instance, are trying to broker any kind of discussions between them to try and sort anything out. But it doesn't seem that there's much point of agreement that you could agree on, because, Canada's perfectly within its rights, as far as I can see, to say, you do not start doing things that we believe you're doing within our territory as a supposedly friendly state.
I mean, John, you did allude to a possible next step, i.e. the actual shuttering of the missions, but again, on that ladder of escalation within the realm of the diplomatic spat, if we rule out the prospect of gunboats being sent in either direction, which I think is probably pretty unlikely, what other actual steps are there to signal one's extreme dudgeon?
To go further from here, do you mean? Well, you start to close deputy high commissions. I don't know how many there are in both countries, but probably a few. Then, if things get really bad, you seek the total withdrawal of staff. So you actually have you still have diplomatic relations, but nobody to actually carry them out. And if things deteriorate beyond then you're looking at a breach of relations.
I mean, and just to follow that up, how difficult is it to repair a breach like that if things have been formally severed? Is it usually a long process?
No. I mean, it's diplomacy is resilient. It's amazing how people will bounce back. In the Cold War, there were repeated cycles of people throwing out each other's diplomats and then hugging and kissing. Well, not quite hugging and kissing, but I mean, at least establishing that you weren't going to continue down that road. The diplomats coming back, shrugging and getting on with it again. That might well happen between India and Canada, but there will have to be a whole lot of really quite complicated behind-the-scenes conversations before we get to that point.
Does it seem to you, Terry, a reasonable response? Because I've mentioned this on the show in similar circumstances before. It was never clear to me why the United Kingdom didn't do something of the sort after Russian agents unleashed a nerve agent on the town of Salisbury.
Yes, I think there were certainly people who were thrown out at that point, and we've got an inquiry going on into that at the moment. But I think one of the things that it might have an effect on, particularly if you're a Canadian who's got family in India, or the exchanges between the two. One of the other things that tends to happen, as well as diplomatic incidents, is we will make it harder for you to travel between these countries. You might get charged a huge amount for a visa or something. And I can imagine if there are big communities who would like to go back and visit their friends and relatives or whatever, there's probably going to be a few months of where that might be a bit annoying.
Yeah, the reason that the UK didn't throw out more Russian diplomats after the Skripal attempted murder was because we wanted to show the Russians that we knew who their intelligence officers were. We threw out exactly the right ones, and not just the UK, but of course a lot of intelligence agents from from Russia got thrown out from across Europe. This really rattled the Kremlin. They had no idea that we penetrated them quite so far, and it particularly upset the intelligence agencies, who've been trying to fight their battle with half an arm behind their back ever since.
Well, to North Korea now, which does seem vaguely concerned that Russia might have designs on its long-held title of world's most pestilential neighbour. The zany funsters north of the DMZ have blown up a bunch of the roads and railway links which in somewhat less fraught times connected the two Koreas in certain limited circumstances. The explosions follow threats to exactly this effect made last week after, or so North Korea claimed, South Korean drones scattered counter-revolutionary tracts over Pyongyang. Possibly ominously, North Korean media reports that General Secretary Kim Jong-un has abandoned the dessert trolley long enough to chair a meeting on national defence, at which he, quote, suggested measures specified in the reports of different defence and security organs. We will come back, John, to what on earth that might mean. But first of all, these roads and railways, which are now no longer with us, how important were they?
No, this is a symbolic act. I mean, these roads, these railways haven't carried any traffic for a very, very long time. They only work where you are moving stuff across the inter-Korean border, which, of course, hasn't happened since the great breakdown of relations in 2019 at the Hanoi summit. So there's a lot of symbolism going on. And the South Koreans protest because, of course, one protests these things, call this abnormal behaviour, fire off shots into the air to show how cross they are. But no one's really surprised. The interesting point is going to be what the North Koreans try and blow up next, because the only remaining road between North Korea proper and the demilitarized zone is the one leading into Panmunjom itself. So if you blow up that road, you effectively isolate all the North Korean buildings on the northern side of the Panmunjom complex. They haven't quite gone that far yet.
It's always interesting to recall at a moment like this, Terry, that there are people in South Korea's Ministry of Defence, Foreign Ministry and Intelligence Services whose job it is to contemplate a road or railway being blown up and ask the question, well, what do they mean by that?
Well, yes, and it does seem to mean that they are, as John says, doing a symbolic gesture to say, no, we are two completely separate systems, as if anybody sort of thought otherwise, given, the amount of, military there is, on the border. I don't imagine anybody suddenly thinking that reunification in either direction is going to happen anytime soon. But it is just them sort of saying, look, no, you are separate to us, you are hostile. And then, there's been for months this exchange of, drones and balloons and all sorts of strange missiles crossing over the border, and this seems to be another stage in that.
John, we should do an amount of whatever the North Korean equivalent of Kremlinology is. I don't know, is there a phrase for it? Or
Not yet.
Not yet. But it is a bit like that sort of process in Cold War times of, looking at the photos on the reviewing stand of the annual May Day parade and trying to figure out who was standing, 3 feet closer to Khrushchev than they were this time last year. In among the North Korean reporting or Korean reporting of these events, we hear from Kim Yo-jong, little sister of Kim Jong-un. She is being attributed with a threat to destroy Seoul if more drones, whether official or not, penetrate Pyongyang's airspace. Is it significant that this is being attributed to her and not him?
Yes, it is, because if you... a statement by the leader himself, you cannot walk back from. A statement by a mere deputy director of the of a party bureau, which is what technically Kim Yo-jong is, you publish, but is not as authoritative. This is the North Koreans expressing anger without making such a formal position. But the statements are fascinating. Firstly, Kim Yo-jong clearly doesn't use any sub-editors. It's just stream of consciousness, expletive-laden. I mean, my North Korean vocabulary has been increased no end by reading Kim Yo-jong's various thoughts. And she put out one long statement to which you refer. She's also put out two sentence statements since, also expletive-laden, saying, firstly, I have no doubt that this was the South Koreans. Secondly, that those who train mongrel dogs if you please, to send drones across Pyongyang deserve to suffer the consequences. The American bastards will pay for this. So a direct threat to the United States. Now, it's not at all clear what this threat might be. At the moment, she seems to be just fulminating. But clearly the whole episode has really, really rattled the North Koreans. Having drone or drones, it's not clear how many drones were actually sent, dropping some quite inflammatory leaflets right over central Pyongyang shows, firstly, that their air defences are useless. How did the drones ever get there? Secondly, that they feel vulnerable. That stuff like this dropping into the hands of Pyongyang citizens, so the key people, the people they must keep on side, they regard as an existential threat to the regime. They're very worried and probably rather frightened.
There's one more follow-up to that, John, which I will come back to. But first of all, just generally, it's a dynamic familiar, I think, to a lot of polities, both internally and externally, Terry. You're always at a disadvantage if you are the broadly sensible antagonist. If you've got a kind of opponent, whether it's a political opponent or a diplomatic opponent who just does stupid, annoying stuff, how do you respond to it without yourself doing stupid and annoying stuff?
Well, yeah, it's difficult. I mean, if the rhetoric is at the level, that John can translate, these kind of things about mongrel dogs, it is difficult to try and respond to that you're obviously not going to respond in like manner. But I think, sending things like drones, and this is a very, it's more modern technology for a very old technique. It was the kind of thing that was used in the First World War, sending leaflets over into enemy territory, because you've got to use whatever way you can to try and appeal past the leadership and hope that you can get directly to people on the ground, and that, the proportion of people who will feel brave enough to pick up a leaflet and read it and take it home, because who knows what might happen to someone who's found with one of those. It probably isn't very nice, but that is one of the few ways that you can try to get your message across to people who might be able to hear it.
Well, that's kind of the question I wanted to ask, John, because, well, there's a lot we don't know about these drones. One, we don't know that they actually existed, and two, we don't know whether, if they existed, whether they were sent by agents of the South Korean state or freelancers, if you were. And there does seem to be some suggestion that those balloons that were floated over the DMZ from South Korea a while ago were a private endeavour. But yeah, exactly that. If there is South Korean capitalist running dog counter-revolutionary propaganda scattered on the footpaths of Pyongyang, one, how many North Koreans are going to dare touch it with a barge pole? And two, if any of them do actually read it, how enticed are they likely to be?
To answer your second question first, they don't need to read it because, incredibly, the North Koreans published the leaflets. I mean, it's in Rod and Simon, it's in the party paper. You can see what the South Koreans are saying. And it's all about how Kim Jong-un and his daughter Kim Jo-ae are going around wearing the smartest possible clothes while everybody else is going hungry. How much food can I buy on a South Korean salary compared to how much food I can buy on a North Korean salary? And so on. It's actually quite powerful stuff. The drones almost certainly exist. I don't think anybody's disputing that. More, they were military drones. You can see from the photographs, these are not the drones you can buy from your local drone shop, and not the kind of drones that you could put together using a 3D printer. Somebody has got access to military drones. It may well be the South Korean government, despite denials of the contrary, unlikely to be an NGO. For an NGO to be able to rehearse this kind of mission, get that drone in the air and into Pyongyang without anybody stopping it, beggars belief. Second point, they probably weren't launched from South Korea. If you want to get something over Pyongyang, the fastest way, the quickest way rather, is from an offshore vessel, which raises the possibility that this indeed wasn't the South Koreans. Some people are saying the Ukrainians. you get yourself a friendly boat, you've got plenty of drones, and you discomfit your major enemy's major ally. It does have a certain sense to it.
Indeed so. Well, we shall follow that one with interest. But here in the UK, meanwhile, it appears that the live music circuit is not what it once was. According to research by the Music Venue Trust, there are a lot fewer venues and artists are playing a lot fewer shows in such venues as there still are. The problem is basically for all but a tiny minority of acts operating at any kind of profit, putting on a single show loses money, whereas embarking on an actual tour loses multiples of it. Calls are therefore being made for various amounts of government assistance. To establish a benchmark, our rock and roll credentials here at this table, I will ask you each in turn. Terry, first of all, what was the last thing actually resembling a gig that you personally attended?
I think I told you about this the other day. Patti Smith at St Paul's Cathedral.
You did.
So, good gig, relatively small venue, but an absolutely amazing venue. So maybe we need new and different.
I don't think we can really think of St Paul's Cathedral as sort of like the
new Wembley Arena,
the grassroots punk rock dungeon.
Not really, no.
No.
Yeah.
John, what about you?
My nephew playing Paul Simon at my other nephew's wedding. So not quite up to Patti Smith. I mean, I'm a few pegs down from Terry here, but that's the last one I went to.
See, I am sympathetic to the plight of touring bands. I know many of my friends do some variant on this for a living, and I'm sure it's worse now, Terry, but I was thinking about 12 years ago, I embarked upon a tour in cahoots with Luke Haynes and Cathal Coughlan in support of an album we had made together called The North Sea Scrolls. Copies still available. The tour was, I think, 6 or 8 dates. I think 8 dates around the United Kingdom and Ireland. All the shows were sold out. It did actually quite well. We had a couple of decent guarantees from a couple of the venues. We sold some merchandise. And I remember sitting down with Luke and Cathal at the end of this to sort of do all the sums. And once we had paid for the trains, the hotels, hired Audrey Riley to play cello, and various other outgoings, our 8-date tour of the United Kingdom netted us £35 each.
I think the economics of it, and also, think if you were trying to do that now, a lot of bands have found it's really difficult to go anywhere beyond the UK just because of the difficulties of getting visas now to go and play in Europe.
Another Brexit bonus.
Another Brexit bonus. And I think it is difficult because there's so much money goes into, this is the problem people have been pointing out, these huge things. Everyone's saying about the Taylor Swift economic bounce of the sheer amount of money that is spent on tickets and hotels and these big venues. And, Coldplay got a tour coming out where they're literally doing Wembley and Hull, apparently. But around me, there are some lovely venues like the Union Chapel in Islington, which is a really perfect size. And you can see some really good people there occasionally. But I think, that I wouldn't want to go to the really massive stadium things because you can't see anything. You're kind of going that, there's a small dot in the distance, which is the person you're supposedly coming to see. And so, I hope they do survive.
I would offer, a couple of counterpoints to this. Again, I am sympathetic, but also on the you can't see anything thing. That has also been my experience at recent outings to small or medium-sized venues. You end up looking at a wall of other people's phones and you can't hear anything because for some reason people just want to carry on talking all the way through the performance.
Yes, there's a lot wrong with venues in general. But there are other points here. Firstly, what is happening to music is actually the same as what is happening to sways of the rest of the economy. Everybody is moving from large numbers of small venues to smaller numbers of large venues. It's not just concerts, it's hospitals, it's police stations, it's tax offices, if you like. Everybody's concentrating in a smaller number of venues. Economies of scale and, of course, relative ease of travel. A lot of the smaller venues were set up at a time when it was much more difficult to move around than it is now. I noticed that one of the music promoters who was interviewed on this problem complained that some people were having to travel for an hour and a half to get to the venue. I mean, come on. I know people who commute an hour and a half each day, each way, just to get to work. It's really not a huge deal right now. Secondly,
this is not somebody who ever lived on the northern beaches of Sydney and wanted to go to a show at Selena's in Coogee.
No, I think that's a pretty fair bet.
That was about 2 hours each way.
Yes. Okay.
Sydney is a ridiculously large place, however. Terry, I have a cranky libertarian counterpoint to put to this. Is this not simply that the market has decided? Are we not seeing a similar phenomenon that we do every time some high street fixture closes, whether it's a department store or some other sort of shop, and there's much lamenting online about people going, oh my God, life will never be the same again. And then you ask them, when did you last shop in one?
Well, it's true. I mean, luckily you asked me when did I last go to a gig, and I had actually been to one. But before that, the previous one was, possibly in the last century. So no, it wasn't. I think I saw Suzanne Vega at the Union Chapel relatively recently. But I think actually, more seriously, one of the things it still hasn't recovered from is the pandemic and lockdown. And I think a lot of venues just wouldn't have survived that. And I think, as with so many other things in our social lives, it has taken us much, much longer than we thought to get back to doing things in a big space with other people. And I think, there's probably still been a reluctance or an amount of planning or whatever that means that people have kind of thought, do I want to go and do that? Maybe I don't.
Do we also suspect, John, perhaps that there is now much more of a thing than there used to be of people thinking, well, I can be entertained at home for almost no expense. I'm not going to be surrounded by sweaty morons. I won't have to pay for a tube. I won't have to worry about getting a taxi home. The heck with it.
Yes, absolutely. Not just can I be entertained, can I hear this music, but now, of course, you can put your video up and see them, often in 3D. Why pay the extra? Why, as you say, suffer the dignities of long-distance travel, sweaty people who will always put their phone up right in front of you at critical moments at any venue, just to be there with the artist. Is the virtual experience not actually better in many ways?
Well, we have further bad news for John Everard's social life, because city burghers in Prague have voted to ban the organised pub crawls popular with bibulous Brits, less so with anybody in their vicinity. The Czech capital appears to be wearying of its reputation as a fountain of cheap beer and wishes to discourage stag parties, lads' weekends and John Everard in favour of a more refined and ideally more wealthy class of tourists. Prague joins Amsterdam in having either or both enacted rules or launched an ad campaign to encourage young British men to take it elsewhere. John, first of all, it seems only fair to ask, having just portrayed you as some sort of rampaging beer monster, are you broadly in favour of Prague hanging out the sign that says no riffraff?
Absolutely. I mean, no riffraff. Come on, chaps. I mean, the hourly paid rampaging through the street drinking beer. What's the world coming to? Whether it will have any effect whatever is, of course, another question. As you said, Amsterdam have tried this with very limited success. It's now not that I go around organising stag parties or even hen parties, let me make clear, but I'm told reliably it has got a bit more difficult to do so. But it's not that difficult if you really want to have a boozy night out in Amsterdam. And I suspect there's quite a lot of rampaging still going on despite the best efforts of the city authorities. I suspect Prague will find the same. Once a place gets a reputation as a good place to get cheap beer, and beer in Prague is relatively cheap, there's no denying it, and to go storming around the streets at night singing silly songs and doing things you'd never do at home, it's very difficult to shake that off, as Amsterdam has found, as a lot of the Spanish resorts have found. Once you're in, getting out hard.
Terry, is Prague in fact somewhat to blame for having turned itself into this? It struck me about Prague. I went there a long, long time ago when it was still part of something called Czechoslovakia and still effectively a communist country. You still had to change a certain amount of hard currency upon arrival in return for a sack full of local stuff that you literally couldn't give away. And now, it struck me on recent visits, it's one of those places that has become a theme park of itself. There is nothing in downtown Prague anymore that is not there for tourists.
Yeah, I haven't been to Prague for a long time, but I remember going, firstly, before 1989 and then after, and it was... People went there really quickly, and I think in the early 90s, certainly in Prague, there was this idea it's going to be this wonderful literary centre. I think, loads of people I knew there went there going, yes, I'm going to work there and I'm going to write a book, and it's going to be Paris in the 20s and it's going to be this amazing thing. And within a year or two, it was, beer and sort of strip clubs. And that changed really quickly, I think, because it was somewhere that people started going kind of early on. And then quite quickly people started saying, well, no, I'm not going to go there because, yes, they can sell me lots of T-shirts of Kafka, but all of that kind of element of it is a lot harder to find now.
John, I'm guessing this wasn't that much of an issue in Minsk or Pyongyang, but for your fellow ambassadors who have served in the kind of place patronised by groups of young British men trying to have a good time, and listeners, he's already shaking his head, how great a bane of their existence is it?
It is a significant bane. A colleague of mine who worked in, I won't say which, but one of the Spanish resorts, used to sort of clock the arrival of groups, particularly of British football fans. And the night after, or the morning after the arrival, he would simply phone up the head of police and just say, "Cuantos?" How many? and go around, check their passports, try and get some sense out of them, see if anybody had actually committed a real crime as opposed to just being obnoxious. And, you spend the day doing that. It's not a lot of fun.
Terry, who would you keep out of London?
Ooh, who would I keep out of London? Just anybody who walks really slowly on the pavement and who stops to take photos in the middle. There's a particular old phone box in Westminster where the queue to take photos of this phone box, because it's kind of in line with Big Ben, is longer than any queue for an actual working phone box that has ever existed. And if you're trying to get around Parliament Square, it's kind of very, very annoying. So just keep moving, or at least have lanes, Instagram lane and non-Instagram lane.
See, I'd have a snatch squad hovering by that pedestrian crossing on Abbey Road to just like bundle into a van and deport anybody who attempts to recreate the Beatles crossing the street. It's not even the same pedestrian crossing, aside from anything else. John Everard and Terry Stiasny, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it has long been understood that in the 20 years the Taliban were out of power in Afghanistan, their thinking on most matters evolved little. Further proof was delivered this week in the shape of an edict that such media as is still operating in the country will be forbidden to publish any image of any living thing. One organisation for whom this will be yet another headache is Moby, founded in more permissive times in 2002 and still Afghanistan's largest media group. Moby's extraordinary story is told in a new book by its founder and CEO, Saad Mohseni, with Jenna Krajewski. Radio Free Afghanistan, a 20-year odyssey for an independent voice in Kabul. I spoke to Saad Mohseni at Midori House earlier and began by asking him what made him decide to go back to Kabul after settling in Australia.
I lived in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, from 95, 96 till 1999. And then I came back, and I was actually really, really enjoying Melbourne. I was getting into the groove of things. Work was going well. Everything seemed perfect. But for a lot of us, we never had closure on Afghanistan. My father was an Afghan diplomat. He decided to immigrate to Australia because the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. But we sort of maintained everything, the language, consuming Afghan food, socializing with Afghans, reading up on Afghanistan. It was never over for us. So I think just deep inside, we knew that if the opportunity came up, we would go back, which it did. After 9/11, and we came and had a look, and we thought, well, there may be some opportunities, and we set up this small radio station, assuming that we could outsource or delegate the running of the station, and it was just so controversial that it just basically dragged us all back into the country.
Because the extraordinary thing about the beginning of the narrative of Radio Free Afghanistan is that it's not like you go to Kabul with ambitions of being a media mogul. You have this idea that we will go to Afghanistan and we will do something. There's a point at which I think you're going to be almond traffickers. Were you surprised to find yourself thinking, OK, now I run a radio station for some reason?
A friend of mine told me a story that he was in real estate. And people would come up to him and say, listen, I'd like to lease this shop. And he would ask, what do you have in mind in terms of, a business? And they would say, well, what do you reckon? And he said 80% of people would open a shop not knowing what they were doing. And ironically, that's what we did. We went to Afghanistan not quite sure what we were going to do. And almond cultivation, actually working with a listed Australian company at the time, I can't remember the name, but the idea was to do, large-scale farming. It was an accidental business. And we got a small grant from USAID, and we set up this business, and we had a bunch of Aussies, because no one else would come to Afghanistan. Aussie engineers and Aussie radio people, all of us sleeping in the same house. It was quite comical, but quite exhilarating to set up this business.
What was your first moment? Because it's Almond, the radio station, which is the beginning of the Moby media empire. What was your first moment of thinking, God, I think this might work?
Well, even now, I don't think. Well, I'm still not sure if it's going to work or not. No, I've never had that moment. It's one of those strange stories that you talk to others, who obviously start up something, and then it develops into a mature business, and they can relax and spend time away. And it's never stopped being a startup business. We have these existential threats that we face daily. But the thing is that my brother always says, bite more than you can chew and then chew like crazy. We kept on doubling up. So it was radio, then it was a TV station, then a second TV station. Then we set up outside the country. Then we went out to Pakistan, and then we were in Africa, and then we were somewhere else. So we've kept on doubling down, so to speak.
I mean, the book inevitably becomes a history of what now seems like a discrete period in Afghanistan's history. There's the 20 years between two stretches of governance by the Taliban, and that 20 years is obviously imperfect in many respects, and the book is not shy about discussing that. But it's your organisation that, to an extent, chronicles and soundtracks that. Do you have any optimism that period might, I guess, dawn again at some point, that there can be a free Afghanistan with a radio station to match?
Well, I mean, I started writing this book probably around September or October of 2021, assuming that they were going to shut us down. And I had to somehow chronicle what we had achieved, thinking it's all going to get reversed fairly quickly. So I thought it'll be like almost therapeutic for me. It has been cathartic in a lot of ways. But I think what it has helped me figure out is how much the country did change. The population doubled, but the country's still very young. Millions of kids went to school. Every benchmark you look at, the country was transformed by the international presence. Now, we had a corrupt government. It was inept. Obviously, the fighting and the war obviously impacted millions of people. But still, something fundamentally changed in that country. The people changed. You have people who are aspirational and ambitious, and people who want to send their kids to school, all of those things. So while the Taliban have taken over, and Taliban 2.0, it's very similar to Taliban 1.0.
Depressingly so.
In terms of directives and decrees and laws, implementation-wise, it's actually quite different. And that's partly because local Taliban leaders, looking at the communities that they're governing, realize that they cannot go back. Now, I'm not saying that we will not go back to the 1990s era in terms of implementation of these decrees, but it does provide us hope that the people of Afghanistan have changed. And there is pushback in a very subtle way, every step of the way, for them to maintain the gains of the last 20 years.
What kind of adjustments have Moby's outlets had to make, though, to carry on operating in Afghanistan? You do operate elsewhere, of course, but the fact that you're able to carry on working in Afghanistan does suggest you've had to reach some kind of accommodation?
Yes. I mean, for example, we got rid of all music, no more soap operas. So, I mean, we still have lots of entertainment programs like, cooking shows and chat shows and game shows. So we're entertaining, but in a slightly different way. News and current affairs remains, I would say, relatively unchanged. There's no major news story that we cannot break or cover.
You don't even get the sort of menacing phone calls from somebody? Okay.
We do. I think the difference is, for example, if there's a human rights report on the conduct of the Taliban and condemning what the Taliban have done, we report on it. There's a 2-3 minute clip. We get experts to come and, discuss it. But can we do it with a great deal of fanfare in terms of a town hall meeting and then a current affairs program and blah, blah, blah? We have to be careful not to push our luck. So we know the boundaries. By the way, that space is getting smaller for us. And, we do have red lines, and I suspect we're getting close to them. But at the same time, our platforms allow us to air education programs, in particular targeting young Afghan girls, for example. And even today, despite all the restrictions that we have, we're still the best in terms of informing Afghans. Our news bulletins are still probably the best. As a matter of fact, Afghanistan, even today, is freer than most of the region. It's freer than broadcasters in Iran, in the Arab world, in Central Asia, dare I say, even in India or in Turkey.
That's a heartwarming thought.
Well, because we were so ahead of everyone else that even if it's, with our wings clipped, we're still probably, I'm obviously being a little maybe too optimistic in terms of how free we are, but But I think we're still in a place it gives us still satisfaction to be able to operate. Now, it may not last, but as things stand right now, I still think that we're fulfilling our role as a media news outlet.
That was Saad Mohseni, founder and CEO of Moby. His book with Jenna Krajewski is Radio Free Afghanistan, a 20-year odyssey for an independent voice in Kabul. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, John Everard and Terry Stiasny. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.